To be a Shara Tuesday, you're still watching Morning Cafe with me, Anne Odida, and this morning we are unpacking the practical side of Africa's push for economic integration. We're talking about digital borders, trade corridors, and what it really takes to make East Africa just more competitive, not just within itself, but of course across the entire continent. And joining me for this conversation this morning is Lillian Mwai, the county director of Trademark Africa, and that is a development agency working to make trade easier, faster and more inclusive, of course, across the region. Karibu sana Lillian to TV47.
Thank you so much, Anne.
All right, to start us off, what does Trademark Africa, mean by business competitiveness? And this is in the African context.
Thank you for that question. Trademark Africa basically is an aid for trade organization, and what that means is that we were established when we realized from a review that Africa is not trading amongst itself and also with other global markets. And we do know that trade is a key economic driver and helps to result in reduction in poverty. And so when you look at business competitiveness, we asked ourselves, how competitive is Africa to actually take part in business? And when we looked at that, we looked and identified that there are different challenges that we face. That could be around infrastructure, it could be around trade policy, it could be around the digital systems that exist. It could be around there not being any platforms or opportunities for inclusive and resilient trade, meaning that women and youth are also not participating. And so in 2010, Trademark Africa was established. At that time it was called Trademark East Africa. We started with a focus on Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, Burundi, basically. And we were looking at how do we make sure that we are now facilitating. We are not actors, we are facilitators, and what that means is we look at the trade ecosystem. For trade to happen, there needs to be support from the government in terms of the policy environment, in terms of the taxation that exists, in terms of the policies that are established. The private sector also should be capacitated in able to participate in trade. And also when you're looking at regional trade, then regional economic communities come into play. How do we make sure that countries within the EAC are trading with each other? How do we make sure that COMESA is also participating and such? And so we have been working with each of these trade ecosystem players to build their capacity, understanding whatever challenges that they are facing, so that we can be able to make Africa more competitive with each other, to trade amongst ourselves, and we can also be able to help African countries access global markets.
If you look at it from a country-to-country perspective, how does this differ? Say, when we zoom into Kenya, looking at Tanzania and Uganda, how are we trading on a country-to-country basis?
That's a very good question. Actually, when we look first, let's even look at ourselves as Kenya. We are net importers, so we are not exporting as much as we are importing, and that's characteristic of many African countries. We have a lot of resources, we have a lot of tea, we have a lot of coffee, especially around agricultural value chains. We have very good competitive value chains, but then we are exporting these products as raw materials, and that's what is similar. So the challenge becomes when also in Tanzania, they are also producing the same things. Uganda, similarly, are producing the same things. So that means that there's limited opportunity for us to trade each other because we all are actually working within the same space. And so how do we make sure that we increase level of trades amongst ourselves? So that mainly happens if there's a deficit. So say there's a maize deficit in Kenya, then maybe you'll have to look at Tanzania or Uganda and see how you can import some of those produce. But largely we have the same thing. So that's where the issue on value addition comes, and also development of additional and different value chains, maybe non-agricultural, that we can be well known for example, steel, for example, pharmaceutical products that then we can be able to manufacture in Kenya and start exporting and distributing to other African countries. So that's the position, is that it's not taking much shape as we would want to, because we're largely having the same type of products, especially agricultural produce.
But isn't there room for us to just trade beyond Africa now that, you know, Trademark Africa, you're trying to help with this intra-African trade,
yes,
whatever is happening. But isn't there a chance for us to go past now
yes,
trading Africa to Africa?
yes,
If you say that sometimes the challenge is that we have the same commodities, say maybe Kenya and Tanzania maize, but as Trademark Africa, is there room for us to trade beyond Africa?
There's a lot of room for us to trade beyond Africa, but then that brings the issues around certification and standards, especially if you're looking at markets or traditional markets as the European Union and also the UK, where we know that they have standards that they have set that countries are expected or business are expected to comply with for them to gain entry into those particular markets. And so what we do is also being able to build the capacity of the countries and also the private sector to be able to meet those quality and standards requirements so that they can access those markets. For example, we have worked with the Kenya Bureau of Standards, who we have been able to partner with to buy testing tools to be able to develop certifications and to make sure that the protocols are clear so that then the private sector can be able to utilize this to give them a mark that certifies that they are allowed to be able to access certain markets so that there's more trust, because trade is built on trust. And how do you show trust? It's through having certifications, through processes and procedures that other countries can be able to trust. There's also an opportunity for us to continue to trade also with other countries in Saudi Arabia or the UAE as well. So we look at the opportunity for Africa to grow trading with each other and also with global markets. And when we talk about Africa trading with each other, of course, the Africa Free Trade Continental area comes into play as well. Yeah.
Do you think from where we sit now, from country to country, let's say now Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, for instance, we really understand, you know, what each and every person is bringing to the table? Are we all well informed in terms of, you know, the commodities that we are trying to export and import, what we need to give and what we need to take, how we need to, you know, just strengthen ourselves in terms of just trade and meaningful trade? Are we well informed as a region?
I would say there's definitely, when you talk about trade, there's always barriers to entering trade. There's the issue to market access. So how do I access a particular market? And there could be issues on maybe standards being a key player, especially the international markets. There could be a lack of information in terms of what are we expected to do to be able to reach those markets, not only at the private sector level, but also at the government level. Maybe there's the capacity of the officers who are supposed to be checking some of these standards and regulations that have been set by other countries is also not at par. So again, also working with some of these institutions like KEBS and the Kenya Plant Health Inspectorate as well, KEFIS, we work to build the capacity of the officials and officers who are tasked with checking that the quality and standards are being met. So yes, we see that there's a gap, and that's where we come in and we bring our technical capabilities and we build the capacity of those officers, those officials. Where needed, we do provide equipment where possible, so that there's a deeper understanding on what is required to be able to trade with the world and also with each other. I would say something else that we have seen is maybe there's a lack of standardization in terms of what is expected. Kenya could have a different standard, let's say in terms of measuring aflatoxin levels, maybe compared to another country like Tanzania or Uganda, and that in itself can be a barrier. So we are looking at how do we create more standardization and harmonization around standards, around the policies, and then how do we make that move forward? So the biggest challenge is each country is very protects itself in terms of having their own standards, and those standards also can result in barriers so that then we are not able to access, yet we are neighbors, we're not able to trade with each other effectively. And so we work together with those, with the regional economic communities to be able to see how do we address this more country level thinking and to make it more regional and to be able to open up those doors for trade.
Right, and still on just at that point, and I'd love for you to just expound on it even more, because I understand that in Kenya, for instance, competitiveness might hinge a lot on ICT and of course services, and if you look at Uganda, for instance, it may rely more on agriculture. So how are you tailoring solutions just to based on each country's, you know, say advantage, what they're best in. So how are you tailoring these solutions as Trademark Africa?
That's a very good question. So how we look at trade, we look at a continental level, at a regional level, and then at a country level. So for example, in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, we do have specific country programs that then do a deeper dive. So there's a country director for Uganda and Tanzania who does a deeper dive into understanding and contextualizing the challenges that are specific to that country. And then we go up another level where, after understanding those challenges at the different levels, then we have regional teams that look at what are the challenges with digital systems Kenya is facing, Uganda is facing, Tanzania is facing, and how do we maybe integrate that into making solutions that are going to help make it easier. Then as well as looking at the standards as well. So there's what we have as the Kenyan standards, then we have a different standard in Tanzania. How do we look at harmonization? So we look mainly at trade as an ecosystem, So we don't just look at one specific area. We work across 6 portfolio areas. We have the trade and policy environment, so where we look at the policies, the taxation guidelines and regulations for each country, and then how do we look at also agreements within the EAC and different country agreements with other countries which are bilateral as well. How do we bring this together and harmonize, and especially through these regional economic communities? For example, with Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania being under the East Africa community. Secondly, we look at issues on standards, as I previously mentioned. So what are the challenges that are hindering trade? Is it that Kenyan standards are too high, Ugandan standards are too high? What is the right level so that we can be able to allow seamless trade? We also look at digital systems, as you've previously highlighted. How can we use digital systems to lead to a lot of trade happening? For example, here in Kenya and also within the region, we did a regional trade program that's called the Women in Trade program. And under that particular program, we developed a digital platform, trading platform that's called iSoko. And this was targeting cross-border traders and to see how do we help there to be seamless trade. You know, when you look at the borders, there's a lot of opportunity for trade to take place, yet the barriers still exist. So how do we simplify that, and how do we use digital systems to be able to make sure that a Kenyan trading with a Ugandan understands what are the taxation laws in Kenya and vice versa? How do we make sure that they are able to access each other easily? How do we make sure that they are able to, you know, raise any flags if they're experiencing any red flags? How do we also build their business capacity in terms of bookkeeping, in terms of accounting? So that's just one angle in terms of digital systems. Then we also look at physical connectivity and infrastructure. When we talk about borders that are actually the points of entry from one country to another, how do we make sure that they are seamless and they're effective to allow for ease of trade? So for example, when we started our work in 2010, at the border points, you'd find Uganda has its own building and its own facilities in terms of a trader or a person moving from Uganda would have to come first clear in their country, then cross over after a few kilometers onto the other side, then go through a similar process of clearing so that you can enter the other country. So we established what is called one-stop border posts, which are operational, Busia, Malaba, and you can be able to see that the infrastructure is much easier. We are able to bring all these institutions into one structure so that a person who's passing through these countries just goes to one stop. They're able to meet the authorities of Kenya, authorities of Uganda. They're able to seamlessly be able to comply and then move to the next destination. So that's around physical connectivity, just an example. Then the other area, or fifth working area, is on greening trade. As we know, the world is becoming more conscious. Even consumers are becoming more conscious on the digital the carbon footprints that are being left due to the high demand that we have. We want sodas, we want clothes, we want easily packaged items, plastics, but then they're leaving a very bad environmental footprint. And so consumers are becoming very, very aware of this, and they're starting to push some of these regulations. For example, consumers in Europe are saying, we don't want to see produce or flowers, for example, that are coming by air. Could we use the sea? Yes, it's a longer journey, but it's more, leaves a less carbon footprint as well. So then we're working on greening trade, and how does that look like for Africa? Then lastly, we're looking at inclusive and resilient trade. How do we make sure that women and youth are well included into trade and are being given an opportunity to make money and to also increase their incomes and also to reduce their poverty levels? So when we look at trade in that more ecosystem thinking, then we are able to find out where are the gaps. What is making us not be able to trade with each other? Sometimes we are not able to trade with each other, as previously mentioned, especially in the early years, because of the physical connectivity. There could be roads which are not well connected between borders, so why would I want to take that long journey? It could be issues, again, on systems. The systems are complicated, there's a lot of paperwork, and so that again, may make a trader decide, I don't want to participate in trade with Uganda or with Kenya, because again, it's a very cumbersome process. So how do we use digital systems to be able to make it easier? So that ecosystem thinking and then allows us to work together in a unified manner, where we are also able to design programs, regional programs, where we are targeting a specific group of countries, and then we drill down to what are the challenges. We select a few intervention areas that we can work on. We track those for results, and then we continue to build and learn as we go.
You mentioned something about women, of course, and youth, and at Trademark Africa, you're known for, you know, you champion so much for women. And somebody might wonder, why women? You said women and youth, but why women? We don't hear the men there. So why is Trademark Africa focusing so much on the women?
That's a very good question. Just to mention, all these areas that we work in are seeking to benefit all SMEs regardless of gender. But that said, we do recognize that women are
disproportionately affected.
I'm telling you, English has come from the West. But yes, they are disproportionately affected.
Disproportionately affected, yes.
Because they experience unique challenges. When, for example, let's look at the cross-border traders that we have supported. In the past, before we were able to work with them, we did an analysis to better understand what are the challenges that women are facing, especially in the border posts. And many of them, because they did not understand what it would require in terms of having access to information. What do I need to comply with so that I can be able to trade and make sure my produce moves from Kenya maybe to Uganda or Tanzania and vice versa? And they were not, there was no understanding there. So what would they do? They wouldn't use the official routes on the border posts. They would tend to take what we call panya routes, and which are very dangerous, meaning that they're passing through forests, rivers, places where there's no security, and endangering themselves. And just because they do not have an opportunity to understand. So through the Women in Trade program that I have discussed, we were able to work with 180,000 women. We were able to think about how do we reduce these barriers by designing this ISOCO platform that I have spoken about and which I can delve deeper about. We were also able to understand that because they did not know what exactly they needed to be able to cross the border or to take part in trade and do it confidently, then if we were able to help them form joint border committees where they would also participate through having representatives. So in these joint border committees would have all the government institutions that are involved in trade. Would have the KRA, if you're talking about cross-border trade with Uganda, the URA, would have health, would have all of these people sitting in this board, and then we have these associations. The women were included, also other business member organizations were included, and they were able to discuss issues openly. And from there, they were able to get information on how do you access, standards? How do you make sure that, there is security? So by virtue of them getting this information, they became more confident. And so we were able to see them participating in trade, starting to use the official routes. They were now informed if they are experiencing any challenges, which institution they would be able to speak to. Through this, again, one-stop border post, where we put all these institutions in one building, it made it more seamless. So instead of you going to figure out where is this institution placed and you're searching around, if you just enter into this one information center, you can find out how you're able to resolve some of these issues. And so women then are able to participate. But we also know that women are the backbone of the economy in terms of we as they say, when you empower a woman, you empower a village. We tend to, once they find out this information, tell other women as well. And then women tend to also focus a lot on the family unit. So once you empower a woman, they'll educate their children, they'll educate other women, they'll be able to participate in making the community move to next levels as well. But again, that said, you notice that very few women do take part in trade, and especially around those borders, because they face a lot of harassment. So that in itself is what made us decide, okay, we need to find a solution. If we're going to work on these borders, we're going to improve the physical connectivity, we're going to make digital systems investments with institutions like KRA and URA and TRA as well, then how can we be able to work downstream to make sure that trade is more inclusive? I would say that the barriers that all SMEs or all business people face are the same, but I would say for women it's much more unique because they have to think about harassment and how they are protected against such incidences.
Very well said. And maybe you could also highlight some of the initiatives that, you know, have hindered effective participation of businesses across the East African region, you know, and specifically for the SMEs in this regional trade.
Oh yeah, that's a very good question. I would say many businesses, of course, face a lot of challenges when you come to talk about costs, cost of doing business. The cost of doing business is quite high sometimes because you see you have to comply with the standards, you have to pay the taxes, you have to purchase. I mean, there's many barriers that they face, there's logistical challenges as well. And when you bring all those things together, then you have to think about access to finance as well. Then how do we also access these markets? Because you can hear that maybe there are opportunities in Uganda or Tanzania or in the UK or in the EU because there are certain agreements that exist, but you don't know how to access this information and how to access this market. So then again, that makes trade a bit challenging as well. Then there's also standards, as we've mentioned. Standards are important, but there is a cost associated with being able to comply with the standards because there are things that you're supposed to do probably sometimes at the farm level or some certain tests or certain equipment you need to be able to verify that those goods are good for trading, and that has a cost in itself. Then there's also issues on capacity building and how do you scale. A business might be ready to move to the next level, but they do not know how do we get to the next level in terms of what information is needed. They also lack mentors and people to give them guidance on how to maneuver and problem solve as well. So these issues then mean that only few people are able to participate in exports and big business. So many of the businesses and individuals are pushed more to informal businesses because then the cost of compliance is quite high. And so that's what we have seen.
You mentioned something about the rebrand that, of course, TMA once had. I remember when you were starting around 2010, it was Trademark East Africa.
Yes.
Right now it's Trademark Africa. So
Yes.
why was the shift necessary from Trademark East Africa to Trademark Africa?
That's a very good question. I would say we started with a smaller mandate because Trademark Africa is a very unique organization. There are not many trade facilitation organizations that exist in Africa with that core focus of Africa. And so when we started with the Trademark East Africa, we wanted to test and see, okay, if we improved the physical infrastructure, if we did some work on the policy space as well, we brought a bit of digitization, could we see exports increase? And at the same time, when we were implementing our programs in that period, the system and the market was also shifting. Many things came into play. The Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement came into play around 2018. So a lot of shifts were happening. And then this whole conversation on Africa trading with each other in terms of how do we build regional value chains, how do we make Africa more competitive and increase Africa trade with each other, then also gave light and opportunity for us to think about what we have already done within East Africa is quite commendable because we have been able to make investments that have resulted in a reduction in costs and a reduction in time spent doing trade. And yet we are seeing other African countries still struggling with similar challenges. And so we thought, what if we took our mandate and increased our scope into West Africa, into Southern Africa? So the name now had outlived its period, and now we are Trademark Africa. So we started in 2010. first with Kenya and then growing into other East African countries. And now we are in 18 countries. So hence the shift in name. Then, of course, COVID also did influence and change the way we do trade with each other. And we thought about, okay, when COVID hit, there was a lot of barriers, borders that were closed. There were borders that were closed into other international markets, and the borders are closed within Africa as well. And you know, we are very dependent on the external markets as well, because we are largely importing. Then we thought, okay, we need to increase the opportunity. And now the FCFTA really did come into play. We need to increase the opportunity for us to trade with each other because we trust each other to some level. Yes, we have standards. Yes, we have other policies, but some of them tend to converge at some point. So how do we make that really work for us within the African context as well? Then again, having been implementing trade facilitation programs for about a decade at that point, we had a lot of learnings and experiences that we believe we could be able to pick up and be able to scale in other countries who maybe still require one-stop border posts to be developed, require some physical connectivity, require digitization of systems in terms of revenue collection as well. And so that was what brought this into play. But we continue to focus largely on the trade corridors because from experience, we have seen that any investments we made along the trade corridors has resulted in increase in trade. For example, we have been able to see a 15% increase in terms of trade with communities around the corridor where we've made improvements and where we focus on, compared to growth that happens probably in areas which are very far from the trade corridors, where you see a 4% increase in trade compared to those who are on the trade corridors, because it means that there's a lot of activity that's happening, a lot of economic activity. And that brings also other questions on and that have also influenced us. What can we be able to do to bring trade into other areas which are not along the trade corridors as well, in terms of development of agricultural value chains as well, and being able to work with the communities around that.
So what are you able to do, and what are you trying to do just to also bring these people who are not in the corridors, like you say, the question that you're not trying to ask yourselves, even as you ask yourself, what are you doing or putting in place to ensure that those that are not in these corridors that you're maybe eyeing, that are brought on board, and everybody's just, working in this, the goals that you have for Africa in terms of trade?
That's a very good question, actually. We do have this program in our Kenya country program that's called the Business Enhancement Export Program, the B program, that is funded by the European Union. And there we work with the State Department of Investment Promotion under the Ministry of Trade. And there we are looking at how do we make Kenya a country that actually attracts investors into this country. How do we make sure that we're able to plug into the opportunities, especially at the county level? So one of the things that we're working on with the State Department of Investment Promotion is development of the County Competitive Index. So where we are able to review how is each county being able to present itself in terms of being competitive. How is it being able to attract more investors so that the people in those communities can be able to get jobs and get opportunities to get out of poverty, because those counties have been able to identify what their competitive advantages are, have been able to identify where their weaknesses are. Perhaps there's more investment needed in terms of electricity, water. And so when those counties are able to reflect, especially based on a tool as the County Competitive Index, then they're able to develop themselves to attract investors, and also taking advantage of the whole devolution, so that then we are able to see that job creation is happening to help eradicate youth unemployment.
And when you talk about your goal, especially, is to just make Africa more competitive in terms of, trade. But if you're asking ourselves, is it healthy competition really? When we're talking about, for example, competition, if you look at it from the school's perspective, sometimes schools compete, with other schools who are doing better than them. But if you're competing within the African, continent right here, who are we trying to impress? Are are the best countries trying to position themselves for the global market? Or if we are competing among ourselves, what exactly is the end goal?
That's a very good question, actually. I like that question. I like it because when you talk about business competitiveness, and that's a very position we've always held as Africa. We have looked ourselves as individual countries, and which may work to our disadvantage because our contribution as a continent to global GDP is quite small. We're talking about 2.5% of the nominal GDP to what is out there. So if we continue, for example, to think as Kenya only, or to think as Cameroon only, or Malawi only, and that means our contribution is much smaller. It's much, much smaller. So that means it reduces our ability to negotiate even with bigger economies because we are quite small and we're not attractive. But then if we look at the opportunity for us to trade with each other as a bloc, or even to create regional value chains that we can trade together with the global markets, then that shifts the conversation there, where we can come into a table and say, as Africa, we are able to produce you or supply you with this, and these are the rates. It allows us to negotiate for better, to get better agreements, to be able to take advantage of the opportunities as exist. But that said, we do recognize that not all African countries are at the same level. And even as we talk about regional trade, as we talk about regional value chains, there are those countries which will be winners and losers when we come into this oneness that we are working towards. Similar to what we see in the European Union. There are bigger countries with bigger economies and other countries which have smaller economies as well. And for them to be able to operationalize the EU, it required them to have a lot of negotiations to decide, okay, who are the ones who would lose? And then you say which country would lose. How do we make them want to participate in this, the European Union? How do we make sure that their interests are met and they give them maybe certain tariffs, certain payments to be able to attract them to want to participate? And that's what basically should be happening to be able to operationalize the AfCFTA. We do recognize that it's a long-term journey, but we do recognize that there are certain steps we can already begin to take with conversations at the regional economic communities that would further hasten the process, recognizing that then we can be able to grow. So if you look at the European Union and the industrialization and the way the countries have been able to grow, it's by becoming, working together as a union. And that would be something that we should be able to learn from others and think about what does it mean for us. And it could mean, for example, that Kenya is well positioned maybe compared to another country to be able to produce steel or to be able to produce ceramic tiles, for example, or to be able to do pharmaceuticals. But also another country could be better positioned than Kenya to do something totally different. Maybe they could be better at garments, they could be better at a different, and then that way, if we look at it in that approach, then we could say Kenya could be the leader in X. Or Kenya could be the headquarters of the leader in X, and any other African country that wants to participate will be given a preferential treatment. But just having that more oneness that in our minds, then that would help us move forward. But that does take a lot of time because every country does look at protecting its own interests primarily.
And when you say that right now you are in 18 countries, maybe just to mention, which country have you seen that is doing quite well in terms of just its reception towards trade and how they try to interact with other countries, and which is still lagging behind that you would say that, for example, say Chad, if at all it's really end-sided. Say Chad, you're doing 1, 2, 3, but we would love for you to do 1, 2, 3 in order for you to get the level of, where Kenya is at, if Kenya is the leading one, or where Tanzania is, if at all it's the leading country.
Yes, so I would like to be politically correct, so I will not mention countries that are facing challenges, but I could talk about countries where we're already seeing some good opportunities, and that, for example, in Ghana, so we did a program within the Kenya Country Program that was looking at operationalization of the AfCFTA through funding from FCDO. So through our partnership with the Kenya Association of Manufacturers and the Kenya National Chamber of Commerce and Industry, we were able to identify a few businesses that we partnered with to take to Ghana for a B2B opportunities, where they're able to identify, okay, what business opportunities exist in Kenya, what business opportunities exist in Ghana, and for actual agreements to be signed. And so about USD 265,000 worth of agreements were signed. And then there we were able to, now we're going to be seeing in the course of this year, because this happened sometime in March this year, we're going to be able to see, okay, what are the challenges and opportunities? Now they have signed the agreement. Yeah. So let's see them operationalize. Let's look at the learnings that we can get from this so that we can be able to get more actual businesses to business to be able to identify opportunities. So we've seen a lot of good reception in Ghana, which was previously not within our scope.
And you know, that is where I wanted to go to. Ghana is just near into TMA.
Yes.
So how are they coming in and then overtaking, you know, the initial countries, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania?
Maybe I would say probably maybe they're having better conversations around what is it that we are doing, especially from a policy perspective, that is going to attract the country to become more competitive. I believe that sometimes we may put in place policies that may seek to protect, but again, may lead to other countries not willing to participate with in trading with Kenya. And so that business environment, looking at it, how do we enhance this and how do we make it more enabling? And the work of making the business environment more enabling is the work of the governments of the day. And so how we engage with that is we are able to identify and work with the Ministry of Trade to identify what are the challenges. We also work with the private sector to understand what are the challenges they are facing. So yes, a policy has come into play. How does it affect you? And then through public-private dialogue between the public sector and the private institutions, they're able to have discussions to see how can we be able to resolve some of the challenges that are being faced. For example, through that program that I mentioned, the Ready program funded by FCDU, we've been able to resolve 25 non-tariff barriers, and we have been able to help more regional trade to be able to happen as well. But it requires a lot of practicality. I believe if we move from the boardroom where some of these decisions around trade, around policies, around taxations are happening, and be able to see how do we create a connectivity between the private sector, who are largely the participants of trade, and the public institutions that are in charge of creating this enabling environment, and also protecting the country and also setting the standards. What does it mean for the private sector? Of course, if it was for any private sector, you'd want to have everything not existence, because it means more money for you. But it also means that sometimes the individuals, the citizens of the country then get exposed to items which are not of good standards, which are not of good quality. So there is the role of government to protect us, but there is also the role of government in being able to create an enabling environment that attracts investors for job creation, that also attracts the local businesses and SMEs to see opportunities for growth, perhaps looking at what incentives can we be able to create to boost manufacturing, to boost industrialization in the country. As we talk about devolution, how do we make sure that these counties are actually well equipped to think of themselves as the people who can create solutions for their counties, so that then we have people within each county not having to all of them migrate into Nairobi, because there are not so many jobs in Nairobi, there are not so many opportunities here. But what is our competitive advantage? And when I talk about the big program that's funded by the EU, we looked at the agriculture value chain. So we are looking at how do we make mangoes, avocados, and veg, which are key export products into the European markets and other markets as well, become something that we can boost and increase. And so here we looked at the counties where we have already been able to see that they have a lot of opportunity. We identified Makueni County, where we are being able to establish an export supply hub that would help the locals, the women and men who are growing the mangoes, to be able to take those produce into one hub. They're able to sort, attract as well exporters to come and pick and buy from them, and so that they can be able to see, wow, there's opportunity in mango farming. Let's say a similar approach can be taken into other different value chains as well. If a county decides this is our competitive advantage, this area grows avocados, for example, quite easily. Another area grows pixies, another area, and we can build an ecosystem that would help this county grow, but also perhaps because of limitation in terms of capital in terms of how much they can be able to invest in infrastructure. How about we think about regionally in Kenya? Could we create an eastern region export supply hub?
Yeah.
Could we, set up some industrialization at that level
Is
as
that
well?
possible?
I think it's possible, but again, if we take away the protectionism and start thinking as a block, it makes it cheaper. I would say, because many of the challenges we face are always around capital. Not only do the SMEs face the challenge of access to funds to develop infrastructure, even governments, we do face. And if we stop thinking too much that this county, which is just close to another county, should establish its own resources and think, okay, could we, as these 3 counties here, be able to look, okay, I grow mangoes, you grow mangoes, you grow mangoes. Can we establish something that can be of benefit to all of us? Probably I am better placed because I'm closer to the northern corridor. Then I will establish this, then you establish the other. That way, then we are able to reduce these barriers in terms of costs and finances. We are able to benefit the communities around, and we will be able to see these communities grow, and then devolution will definitely start bearing its fruit. Yeah.
If I'm understanding from what you're saying, is we're facing more resistance, from the government side. But if we have so much opportunities, if you're talking about, for example, Makueni County is known for avocados, and if we can just set up these, regional county things, to just strengthen what we already have in producing. If we have so much to offer this week, why is there still resistance from the government? Is it fear of taking risks? Because we do understand that, for a thriving business, and trade is basically business, there has to be, somebody who is a risk taker. So why is there resistance?
Well, I would want to say, I'm not a politician, but what I would say from where I sit and from my perspective, and especially looking at trade, is that first, devolution is still continuing to grow. Just like many agreements, the AfCFTA or any other agreement that has been signed, it does take time. It's one thing to shake hands and sign a document, but then how do we operationalize that? And I think the missing link is probably that operationalization mindset is, okay, we have signed this at a national level, we expect this at a county level. What are the gaps and how do we bridge those gaps? I feel more conversations need to be happening around that in terms of operationalization and what are the gaps and challenges, because even as we move towards devolution, there are many opportunities. We are talking about looking at the competitive advantages, but there's also challenges because it requires resources, it requires people, it requires infrastructure. So how do we overcome those? And that's why I was talking about establishment of some of these. We can look at which ones are the bigger capital items, then how can we be able to disaggregate them and put them maybe in a regional perspective, and then which ones they're not too expensive that we can invest at the county level, and which will yield more results and more impact. So really thinking about the operationalization is what, for me and where I sit from, is lacking. And that's where we are able to actually test this and say, okay, let's look at one county, let's look at 2 or 3 counties. Are they well positioned maybe to take part in mangoes and avocado exports, or as well as horticulture? Yes. What are the challenges they are facing? How can we partner with their county? We can do something small. We can do a capacity building training. We can help them build a small pack house. We can help them get some certifications. Then let's see the results. Let us see the impact. Then through that test case, we hope then we can be able to influence other counties. We can be able to influence the government to be able to think about, okay, if this has worked in this one county or these 2 counties that they have worked in this particular program, how do we scale it? Because the work of scaling is the government's mandate, because as organizations that rely on funds from donors, we are only able to do so much. So we want to invest our money, the money of the funders basically, in things that are able to yield results and impact, and then use those things to be able to influence policy, use those things to be able to influence growth within a particular economy.
And I think that will just open another conversation if you're talking about, county to county competitiveness, which we'll talk about some other time. But you mentioned something about digital systems, and I understand you're so heavy on, digital trade infrastructure.
Yes.
What gaps are you trying to fill when you talk about digitization and just enhancing this digital trade infrastructure?
It's a very good question, and I'm very happy to answer it because it's really good to embrace. We're in the digital age, and when you talk about cost and time of doing trade, which is one of our key impact areas, digitization does play a big role in being able to reduce that. And when you speak about digitization, I could speak about previous work that we've done and which we're now building on. We, through partnership with the Kenya Revenue Authority, helped to transition KRA from the SIMBA system into the Integrated Customs Management System, which is ICMS, and which is in use right now. And I believe that has had its benefits in terms of being able to reduce the cost and the time for some of this business to process some of the payments, in terms of revenue, in terms of revenue collection for the country. But we do know that it has a few challenges with system downtime that have been experienced over the years. And currently, we have gotten into a partnership again with the Kenya Revenue Authority, where we will help them to upgrade the system so that it can reduce the downtimes that it has been experiencing. It can be able to develop modules so that when the system is down, it's not the whole system, it's only that particular system, so that the private sector and also other Kenyans are able to get ease into being able to have their payments processed and paid. Also, we are working with the Kenya Revenue Authority in being able to introduce AI scanners. So currently what happens is when cargo gets through the Mombasa port, it's scanned through the scanners, and then someone manually sits somewhere, not manually per se, but with a desktop on some system is able to look through, but it requires a human eye to look through and identify if there's any illegal produce or anything that has been underdeclared. And so through this AI scanner, it would help in quickly processing the information, again, resulting in a reduction in cost and also reduction in time, and helping in revenue collection as well. Then we are also working with the government as well to bring on board the TLIP system, which would allow for more integration of different taxation requirements of different countries. It's quite early days, but then we are looking to integrate. But we believe that through digital trade systems being established, then that means that trade becomes simpler, then it means that there's more ease. So instead of duplication of processes, if you do a scan of your goods, let's say, as it passes through Kenya from Uganda, then that is reflected. Whatever happens with the Uganda customs probably is also being able to be visible to the Kenya customs. They're able to quickly verify, the goods are able to easily transit, and again, making us more competitive so that then it becomes an easier trade corridor, meaning also traders in Uganda or any other country that we are facilitating to use the Northern Corridor feels like, okay, if I get an opportunity to export my goods to the UK or to the EU through the Mombasa port, Kenya is a good and reliable transit point. I can take on additional orders because things will move seamlessly, and so we will be able to see growth not only for Uganda but also for Kenya as well.
So it's still on this issue of digitization. Of course, there could be resistance due to issues of data privacy, say capacity, things like that. So how are you trying to address this resistance and just assure them and also build trust and tell them that we are digitizing these things, but you're safe in the long run? Yeah,
good question. Actually, back to the point on the winners and losers. As you digitize, as you move to more efficiency, as you move to better systems, there's always the losers. And the losers could be, the people, it could be the businesses, or people who've enjoyed for a long time to do businesses not in the right way. There's a lot of people who end up losing. And the question is always, how do you bring them along, especially as you make this shift? How do you build trust, especially around data privacy, so that a trader knows that if I share my information, then it will not get leaked, it will not get misused, or it will not be used to punish me, for example. And so it is important that we work with the agencies, for example, the Kenya Revenue Authority, to identify those gaps. So that's where, again, we come in as facilitators to ask the right questions. So even as we help to move into digital systems, we do ask them questions, and we do ask, how can we be able to make it stronger? How will you be able to do the digital the data privacy. How will you handle the data privacy? And then they'll be able to create modules that are able to make sure that that happens. And then, of course, being able to educate the public and the users to understand how this is going to be done. But for us, as a trade facilitation organization, is to bring those challenges that you're talking about to the agencies that we are working to support, and then helping them to develop those solutions and being able to say, okay, this is not working, that's working, and being the third eye who is an honest broker and is trying to think, okay, how does it benefit the private sector? How do you bring them on board? These are the questions that they would have. And then how do we make sure also the government is getting its part in being able to make sure that their needs, and then being that person at the center who asks the questions doesn't mean that necessarily the one providing the solutions, but the organization that is tasked is at the forefront. But we are making sure that best practice is happening, we are asking the right questions, and we make sure that that it's implemented in the right way.
So where have you faced, a challenge in just trying to encourage digitization in terms of just trade as TMA? And I know I've mentioned something about concerns about data privacy, of course, and capacity. But aside from that, where have you received challenges and just hindrance in terms of trying to, implement digitization and ensure that it works very, very well in terms of regional trade?
Well, that's a very good question. As we shared, each country wanting to keep its data.
Yes.
Each country wanting to protect its information definitely is something that needs to be addressed and looked into. And it does take a lot of trust building, and that requires a lot of workshops, a lot of information sharing, a lot of concerns being shared, and reiterating and kind of repetitive work in terms of creating systems that work. Through this TLIP system, which I've said is it's a novel idea that we're still working on. We are trying to do that. We're trying to bring on board as many countries as we can to be able to accept to share their trade protocols and customs transparently with each other. And definitely that is a bit challenging because there's the government's perspective. There's what we're looking at in terms of trade, but then there's also the position of governments when it comes to protecting itself and it comes to also looking at themselves and how do we grow trade, how do we protect our businesses. So that is still ongoing because digitization is supposed to provide solutions, but you find it's easier to talk about KRA making collection in Kenya easier. But now when you start talking KRA, TRA, URA, let's form one platform, that becomes a bit challenging. But I believe that through this, the regional economic communities like the EAC, those can be addressed. There are certain protocols and agreements that we also have engagements with them at that level through our regional teams. And then we are able to share the challenges and speak to them and see, okay, can you set up agreements, can you set up protocols and policies that would better allow for data to be shared with each other? That is still ongoing, so I cannot speak of anything that we've done as of now.
All right, I'm told we need to take a very short break at this point. We're talking about business competitiveness in East Africa, of course, with Lillian Mwai, County Director, Trademark Africa. Stay with us. This is a very insightful conversation so far. And of course, you're coming back with that point of, the fear to share information. Because I want to understand why are we trying to build Africa and we don't want to share information. Stay with us. You're watching Morning Cafe.
Our world is changing every day, and so should we, for the better. Each week, we tackle the big why, the question that should be on everyone's minds. Why isn't this fixed yet? Deforestation, global warming, and the adverse effects of climate change. The future isn't just something that we inherit, it's something that we create. Join us on The Green Fix as we tell the stories of those who refuse to give up. When it comes to fixing the planet, there is no time to waste. Join me, Shiksha Arora, on Thursdays at 9 p.m. on The Green Fix as we look into the big why, you and I.
For comprehensive information and education on your health, Body Garage is here.
Don't allow anyone to pluck out your good tooth as long as it is strong and stable.
Cancer doesn't start to
Welcome back. Thank you so much for staying with us. You're watching Morning Cafe. It's Biashara Tuesday. This morning we're looking into, East Africa in general matters, trade, business, competitiveness in East Africa. We have Lillian Mwai in studio, County Director, Trademark Africa. And just to mention once again, Trademark Africa is a development agency working to make trade easier, faster and more inclusive across the region. And before we went on that very short break, Lillian, you mentioned something about, one of the challenges that we're facing as a region in terms of just talk about implementing digitization. One of them is the fear to share information. But if we are trying to build Africa really, and we don't want to share information in regards to KRA, TRA, URA, that is Uganda and Tanzania. But does that also open room for us to benchmark in terms of what we can do better as a region to position ourselves as, a global, to the global market in terms of trade, businesses, our exports? Is that a challenge?
Yes, I would say that's a challenge because as we try to move into working more as one, as a union, there are questions which could be coming around, okay, say goods, if you say you're using one system, what does it mean if a good passes through Kenya? Who collects? Who doesn't collect? What happens? So the operationalization of the Africa Free Trade Continental agreement is something that would require for us to discuss these issues, and I believe that we are discussing those issues. And as we know, in 2021 is when we started operationalizing it. We have only selected 8 countries to be able to test this and to be able to see, to learn and to identify challenges that may exist. Not only is the digital platforms in terms of sharing information a challenge, but there's also issues around logistics and how do we easily trade with each other, given that the countries are at different levels of infrastructure development. So that maybe you may find that when you're leaving Kenya, the roads are smooth, you go to another country, the roads are not smooth. So there's the issue on infrastructure as well, and connectivity. There's issues, again, on the harmonization of taxes and standards and certifications. So digital systems are also, they come to make things smoother if some of these other things are also happening. There's ease in physical connectivity, there's harmonization in standards, we've agreed on that, we've agreed on taxation. So then we come and layer it on top. So we also need to look at the fundamental issues and the foundations issues that would bring that into operationalization. And those mainly are discussed around the trade and policy environment, they also, which also flow into standards and certifications that have been established. So that once we've agreed on that, then payment is important, but it becomes another secondary issue. So mine would be to, what I was discussing earlier is, we really need to look at the operationalization, and even as much as we want to pick on digital in terms of revenue, which is quite important, but we still need to address some of these other issues before we get to the revenue bits, which mainly digitization would come, and also the standardization in terms of certification.
Perhaps do you think that as a region we are seeing each other as threats to one another in regards to, and why is that the case really?
As mentioned earlier, when we set up borders and boundaries, then that means, it's the same to anyone in their homestead. When you put a fence in your house, and, it helps to show that this is where my boundaries begin and this is where my boundaries end. And whatever happens in my house does not happen in my neighbor's house. There's preference. There is a difference in opinion. Maybe one country is more open to being quite competitive and attracting investors and growing their value chains and, different, growing into digital. And another neighbor.
Now that brings us to that point. We're not doing healthy competition.
No, we are not. Because everybody is thinking the same way that we're thinking about our neighbors. We're not thinking, hey, actually, if I open this, it means I have a bigger backyard. It means I have bigger opportunities. It means I can tap. If we have a lot of exports that move from Uganda, Tanzania, that sometimes not as much Tanzania, but also moving through Kenya into other markets. And I believe that there's not too much discrepancy in terms of the outputs, in terms of, okay, the banana has been produced here in Uganda, not too different, the coffee, the tea. There's a lot of opportunity. We can talk about tea because tea is traded in Mombasa, and that's where the auction is for many of these countries, and that has worked really well. And for me, it's really, especially as a country director for Kenya, is to think about, okay, if we've been able to do this for tea, how can we do it for other value chains as well? How can we be able to build that trust? And so this is the journey that we find ourselves in, and also being uniquely positioned as a facilitator to be that honest broker in these terms of the trade facilitation, where we have been able to fund different workshops, different discussions, different conventions and summits, where we openly discuss those challenges, where we are also openly able to say, oh, this is what we are seeing is a barrier between this country's trade and that other country's trade. Could we try this thing? And then bringing those ministries into one room of the different countries, and being able to take that opportunity to then look at opportunities for us to trade with each other. For example, we have been able to do what we call national oversight committees, which have a lot of oversight into what we are doing within the country, and especially with governments and the private sector, to be able to improve trade. So each of these countries has that. We do call for national oversight committee meetings, where we invite the different Ministry of Trade or the Ministry of EAC representatives from those countries to come together in a room. We share our updates, we share our challenges, because we are trying to be able to influence this. We are trying to learn from each other, and we are trying to facilitate and make sure that there's smooth trade that's going on. Yeah.
So what do you do as TMA, when a county backtracks or slows the progress on integration?
Oh, that's quite interesting, because the reason for backtracking could fall into different reasons. Of course, maybe it could be shifts in the politics of the day. Maybe there's an election that has happened, a new regime has come into play.
Yeah.
There could be different agreements that they have signed with other, bilateral agreements that they've signed with other countries that they have made agreements with. And some of these changes are mainly at a political level. So what we make sure that we do is that we are also always engaging at a political level to understand those political shifts, and then to see where we can play. So we are a very agile organization. We don't take a very strict position. We try to understand what are the unique contextual challenges that each country is facing. Have they just gone through a political experience? Maybe they've gone through, some security issues in terms of the borders. How do we engage? And so what we make sure to do is that we are always in close collaboration with the ministries of trade. We are in collaboration with the Ministry of Agriculture. We're in collaboration with any ministry that is required to facilitate trade or is a player, and then understand their unique position. And most importantly, find out how do we make sure that there's seamlessness, because sometimes we do find that there are many institutions, but they all somehow have overlapping mandates. And how do we make sure that we understand their role, and then we work with the right partner to move things forward, and we carry the government along with us, because we want there to be ownership. It's not, Trademark Africa is not responsible for trade per se in a country. It is the government of the day. And so we want to build a lot of ownership. We make sure that they're with us as we design the programs. We make sure that also they're sitting with the private sector to understand their challenges. We co-design, we co-implement, we facilitate, we listen to their challenges, we see how we can be able to provide solutions. And so then we are ensuring there's a lot of buy-in from the particular government and also the private sector, so that then trade does happen. And then we really do play as trade facilitators as opposed to becoming ecosystem players, because sometimes if you overstep in either or, you can become an implementer, yet you're just supposed to be facilitating those who are within the ecosystem.
And of course, Lillian, I'm told we need to wind up. There's so much, to talk about. But just as we close this conversation, for one to be recognized by TMA, what is the process? The procedure that one needs to take for one to be, a member or, of Trademark Africa?
Well, that's a very good question. So Trademark Africa is not a member organization. So it's like any other, not-for-profit organization that exists. As I shared, we work with our stakeholders.
Yeah.
So if we are looking at strengthening the private sector, then we would look at the mandate and the agreements we have with our funders, and then determine which associations we'd work with. For example, we've worked with KEPSA, we've worked with the Kenya Association of Manufacturers, we've worked with FPIC, which is an export organization, we've worked with FPC. So we've worked with different ecosystem players, exporters and BMOs and the public sector as well. So if you're a member of those organizations, then you would hear about opportunities to partner with us in the different programs that we are doing. And so that is how you'd be able to take advantage of the opportunity with Trademark Africa. But that said, through our work in digital systems, physical connectivity, all Kenyans benefit. Some of them may not know, but they are benefiting directly or indirectly from the work that we have been able to work with the different stakeholders.
All right.
Yeah.
Just 1 minute. Let me borrow 1 minute for you. What would be your parting shot, in regards to how we are doing in regards to business competition in East Africa and, the region at large?
So in terms of business competitiveness, what is important is that we continue to carry the private sector with us. Even as we make different reforms, even as we make different tax policies, especially a government, is to remember the private sector. The private sector will always want to participate in trade and always will want to create opportunities where there's an opportunity for them to make money. And so by looking at the different interventions that are being brought in by the government and thinking about how does this affect them, does it support them to want to participate? As we know, at least 80 to 90% of jobs are created by the private sector. And so when you talk about business competitiveness, is how do we make the private sector more competitive so that then we create jobs? They want to grow. When they grow, they employ more young people. As they grow, there's more opportunities for Kenya to make more money, and then the economy will thrive. So in terms of business competitiveness, I would believe that the government should continue to create an enabling environment. They should continue to engage with the private sector. And I would say the private sector should in itself, continue to structure itself to speak in one voice so that they're able to easily share their challenges, they're able to speak with one voice, and they're able to properly address the challenges that they're facing so that then solutions are designed to help them to continue to grow.
All right. That is Lillian Mwai, County Director, Trademark Africa. Thank you so much, Lillian. This has been a very insightful conversation, just learning about Africa, trade, and how we are doing. But of course, you mentioned something about the need to demystify trade. We'll look for more time so that we can expand on that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much once again. We take a very short break at this point. Up next, we'll be talking matters first aid, of course, with Brenda Murugi from St. John's Ambulance. Stay with us.